Good evening. It is good to be here with you this evening, and I very much appreciate your coming out to celebrate and to be a part of this pilgrimage. Some 40 years ago, actually it's much more than that, maybe 45 now, my homiletics professor was not a priest, but was a lay person, and he happened to be the director of Center Stage in Baltimore, which might tell you that preaching the sacred word has something to do with theater. It has something to do with knowing your role, knowing your lines, and being able to communicate a clear message. That class was probably the most engaging that I had in my 3 years of theology. I was always on the edge of my seat. Early on, the professor, Peter Coleman, told us, when you begin preaching, you should not be concerned whether your parishioners become better Catholics when you're finished, nor should you be concerned that they become more knowledgeable, more virtuous, or more holy. When you finish preaching, you should only hope that the people are a little bit more in love with the Lord Jesus Christ than when you began. If they are, everything will flow from that. So my prayer this evening is that when we leave our celebration, that we'll be a little bit more in love with Jesus. Some time ago, maybe about 6 months ago, I celebrated a funeral mass for a 91-year-old lady, and I didn't know her. So the family members shared many stories from her long life. Her daughter in particular spoke of that moment when the doctor stood at her bed and told her, "There was nothing more I can do for you." Well, she looked at him and she said, "You are not the one who decides whether I live or die." And then she looked at the nurse standing next to the doctor. She said, "You are not the one who decides whether I live or die." And then she looked at her daughter and she said, "You're not the one who decides whether I live or die." Her daughter fully expected her to say that she would decide for herself. But what she said was, "The Lord will decide whether I live or die." That lady was pretty much aware of what St. Paul is saying in that letter to the Romans this evening. None of us lives for oneself. No one dies for oneself. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. That lady was in hospice care for about 3 weeks, and then she died in the Lord. St. Paul tells us that what we Christians let go of is belonging to ourselves. To request baptism into Christ is to say, I no longer live my life, but now I live the life of Christ. This Lord of our lives is not domineering, but through the love of Christ, we enter a life that enables us to be fully human. The life of the Christian, it's a journey where we gradually see, know, and understand what Jesus is trying to put us in touch with. Our true nature, the best part of us, the true part of us. He puts us in touch with the soul, that deepest part that is genuine and eternal. Our human lives are pretty much a struggle as we buy into all kinds of self-images, all kinds of understanding of who we are as individuals and a people. The journey that begins in baptism is our call to recognize we are indeed human beings immersed in a difficult world, but with a genuine focus on Christ. His gospel teachings again and again prompt us to recognize there is something more if we will only let our own self be drawn into his life. It is no longer I that live, but it is Christ who lives in me. Paul says it for us in the letter to the Galatians. Once we become familiar with the Scriptures, and particularly the gospel accounts, it's obvious one of the major topics Jesus focuses upon is what we have before us this evening: forgiveness. 2/3 of Jesus' teaching, it's about forgiveness. We being forgiven. We becoming a forgiving people. Jesus' teaching, it's a challenge to understand, and it's a challenge to follow through and forgive. So often, we Christians are trying to live this teaching out of a sense of obligation, duty, responsibility, maybe even fear. So with a certain amount of discipline and coercion, we attempt to forgive, to forget, and to move on. For the baptized member of Christ, forgiveness is not a grim obligation. It is a way of life. Feeling pretty good about himself, Peter asks the Lord in that gospel this evening, how many times must I forgive? He thinks that 7 is pretty generous. Only to hear Jesus say 77 times, meaning there is no limit. A member of Christ is to forgive again and again for the good of the person who has done the wrong and for the good of our own selves. Far too often, we're a part of that human scene that we occupy and share with one another, where words and actions hurt and offend. We may have every right to feel anger, to experience disappointment in the behavior of that other person who has impacted my life and those that I love. We might not be able to get through it without talking it through with someone that we trust. This is part of our human lives. Our emotional reactions are to be expected. At the same time, I would suggest we must remember we are members of Christ. That commitment calls us to ponder what Jesus teaches. There's something that does not feel right about punishing others the same way that they have made us suffer and hurt. What does not feel right is the amazing challenge of the gospel. It remains. The challenge is our call to bring life to other people, to be willing to change ourselves, and to help others change. Jesus accepted the human condition. Walking this earth, he saw people messing up, hurting one another. And still Jesus entered in. Even though they murdered him, he was still able to look at his Father and say, they do not understand what they are doing. They really do not understand. Forgiveness is tied to a deep, mature, wise acceptance of our human condition. We each fail. Everyone needs forgiveness. This means we all need the grace and the power within that other person to help us change and be transformed. My suggestion this evening is that we ponder the words of St. Paul. None of us lives for oneself. We live for the Lord. As we fall in love with Jesus, he dwells at the center of our lives. And then, more and more, we will be able to forgive that other person and let our own selves be forgiven. We move to the Eucharist to celebrate here at the altar. Receiving that gift of Eucharist, it is the forgiveness of God, that we might leave this space tonight to be the forgiving presence to one another in our busy world, in our busy lives.